Hello, economics students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 7, Section 3, The Role of Government. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the role the government has within our economic system. And some of it are things that you might have already heard a little bit about. But first main idea is talking about maintaining competition. Anytime we talk about like antitrust legislation, antitrust is to prevent big businesses from getting so big that they dominate the market and they pretty much manipulate things so that they are at an advantage. And so the question is here is what was the antitrust legislation of the late 1800s trying to restrict? And the big thing that they were going after was like monopolies and trust. This goes back to about the 1890s when you had a time period in American history following the Civil War where you had big businesses coming in with little government interference, and in some cases doing things that were hurting the workers, meaning that they were not necessarily well regulating safety within the work environment or concerned about wages and the type of labor that they were using. A lot of times they were using children within the workplace and such. So that's really what these early acts were kind of going after. So, what was the purpose of the Sherman Antitrust Act? This goes back to about the 1890s. And the big thing here was to protect trade and commerce against unlawful restraint and monopoly. So that's kind of what it was. Now, if you go into the whole history of that, there's a lot of debate of how effective the Sherman Antitrust Act was. Even though it was a law in the books, it was very rarely ever referred to within lawsuits until we get into the 20th century. So, number three, what was the purpose of the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914? This kind of comes out of the Woodrow Wilson administration. What practice that it outlawed? Uh, this Clayton Antitrust Act gave the government greater power against monopolies. In a way, it was kind of like a response to everything that was lacking in the Sherman Antitrust Act. It kind of was made better within the Clayton Antitrust Act. One of the things that it outlawed was this idea of price discrimination. And that's kind of the big one as far as businesses being able to give better rates to certain businesses based on the amount of volume of work that they did with them. Anyway, government regulations. Under what conditions are monopolies acceptable? Natural monopolies, for the most part, are okay. That is regulated so that it can't take advantage of the consumer. So if there is on its own no other competition out there, meaning like you have um, a business or some type of company that's out there that has come up with this idea or maybe has technology that no one else has, as long as they're not being taken, allowing the customer to be taken advantage of, the government's going to probably allow that monopoly to exist. It's when consumers are put in a position where they are being treated unfairly, that's when the government will probably uh, interfere with what's going on to try to make it right for the consumer. So, in number two, what is one example of how local or state government allows and regulates monopoly? Local and state governments regulate cable TV companies, the water and electric utilities whenever they increase rates. These monopolies have to go before a regulatory commission. Matter of fact, like in Nebraska, we have regulatory commissions for water and electricity. So if there's going to be, like if MPPD wants to raise rates, they have to go before the board to get permission to do that. And they may have good reasons. I mean, it could be because of the costs that are coming back to them and such, but the idea is that it's regulated so that consumers are, for the most part, being treated fairly. So, government role. If you take a look at the graphic here, they restrict monopolies that hinder competition, regulate monopolies that provide services, and provide public disclosure to prevent any kind of market failures. All right, pre-modified or the modified free enterprise. What government actions led to the modified free enterprise? And a lot of it is passing of laws that prevented evil monopolies and to protect the rights of workers. So the passing of food and drug laws to protect people from false claims and harmful products, government regulation of utilities to prevent price gouging. If you take a look here, you got the Pure Food and Drug Act or the Food and Drug Administration going back to 1906. If you remember some things that we talked about in American history with the Meat Inspection Act and all that. This is all kind of coming out of that. The Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, making sure that we're not having unfair competition or price fixing, any kind of other deceptive practices. The Federal Communications Commission, licensing the radio and television stations to make sure that they are within certain decency codes, regulating interstate telephone and telegraph rates, the Security and Exchange Commission coming out of the New Deal, regulating and supervising the sale of listed and unlisted securities and brokers and such. Again, out of the New Deal, you had the National Labor Relation Boards making sure that labor and management relation laws are kind of looked after, settling any kind of labor dispute, preventing unfair labor practices. The Federal Aviation Administration, they oversee the airline industry. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, this is coming out of really the Great Society of the President Johnson's era of the 1960s, investigating rules on charges of discrimination by employers and labor unions. EPA out of the Nixon administration, protecting and enhancing the environment. OSHA, also out of the Nixon administration, investigating accidents and workplace safety. Consumer Protection Safety Commission, again out of the Nixon administration, developing standards of safety for consumer goods. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, kind of out of the Nixon into the Ford era, regulating civilian use of nuclear materials and facilities. All of that is for our protection. Okay. So, to improve economic efficiency, what are two market failures that the government is able to correct? One is inadequate information in public goods, because the government always is kind of in charge of public goods. That's one that's fairly easy. Inadequate information is making sure that the right information is put out there to the public. So, promoting transparency. What is the purpose of public disclosure? Transparency is this idea that when the government is implementing policy and when businesses are fulfilling that everything is out there in the clear for everybody to see. That's where the transparency kind of comes in there. So what is the purpose of public disclosure? And part of that is to require businesses to reveal certain information to the public. A few years back, Volkswagen got in trouble with some of their emission standards. They were saying that their cars were getting better fuel mileage when some of that data was falsified. So to make things right, they revealed that to the public, and there were people that might have bought Volkswagen cars with the hopes of, but under the understanding that they were going to get better fuel mileage. And certainly they were in a position where if they wanted to take their car back, they could do so. But part of that is disclosure, making sure everybody knows what's going on. What is the advantage of to the public in the truth and advertising law? Part of this is to prevent false claims. So if a product is being touted as, this great wonder the world, this way you can't lie about it. You can't make false claims about the product. It's got to do what it says it's going to do. Providing public goods. Two examples of needed public goods that the government can provide: roads and highways. Certainly governments do a much better job providing that than individuals, but they can also provide other things, things that we can enjoy like museums and libraries. But education is also one of those things that the public can enjoy as a result of the government, and that's through the use of public schools and public universities. Going on. Well, we're finished. Thank you very much.